Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. Welcome to Gutsick-gibbon. My name is Erica, and this is the place that you come to for unnecessarily deep dives into the latest finds with regard to paleoanthropology, primatology, biology generally, just things that I find interesting, as well as a lot of debunking pseudoscience. Today, we're going to be talking about the new human species that was announced, and you'll notice that I say announced and not discovered. Last week, a new hominin was announced as a part of this increasingly populated and confusing period of time called the Middle to Late Pleistocene, or the muddle in the middle. This new hominin's name is Homo juluensis. It comes from East Asia, and we're going to talk a little bit about this guy. Is it real? Is it hype? Is it a unique look at a complicated topic that probably has no concrete and objective answer? Let's speculate. All right, taking my tongue out of my cheek now and being a little bit more serious, this topic is endlessly fascinating and also endlessly frustrating. I've talked about the muddle in the middle, or the Middle Pleistocene into the Late Pleistocene before on this channel when I talked about HLD6. We'll be talking about you again today, HLD6. But in that video, I talked a little bit about the Middle Pleistocene and why it's problematic, as well as many other issue-filled periods of time within human evolution, because it's generally characterized by periods that we know a lot about, and then sections that are quite mysterious for one reason or another. And I think I summarized it well, so here's that. Now, there are many other periods of time that are kind of bugaboos within human evolution. Some of them are because we don't have enough fossils, like how do we identify the oldest hominin after the last common ancestor of hominins and pannins? That's going to be about 7 million years ago. There's another deficit right at the beginning of genus Homo, around 2 to 3 million years ago. And then you have the opposite problem where there are too many hominin fossils and they're difficult to parse out. I think just over 3 million years ago can qualify for this because we have a lot of australopiths, and which one is sort of the root of genus Homo is a pretty big question, but there's so many species of Australopithecus that it's sometimes difficult to determine who belongs where. Throw Kenyanthropus in there as well, and things just become even more complicated. But the classic case of too many fossils has got to be the Middle Pleistocene. The Pleistocene as a geologic period starts about 2.5 million years ago and ends just 12,000 years ago, and it encompasses much of human evolution from the origin of our genus Homo, to like almost present day. The part that is simultaneously super epic and also horribly inconvenient is that we have so many hominin species and they're all pretty variable. So for instance, the Pleistocene is home to not only early members of genus Homo, depending on how you classify them, things like Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, as well as Homo erectus sensulatus. This would include sort of archaic looking Homo erectus like Homo georgicus and Homo ergaster, all the way up into the Middle and Late Pleistocene, where we see familiar faces like Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo luzonensis, and of course, Homo sapiens. But genus Homo isn't the only game in town during the Pleistocene as far as hominins go. Paranthropus is walking around, and members of Australopithecus also still roam the earth. Point being, there were a lot of hominins around during the Pleistocene. However, by the time we reach about 300,000 years ago, which is the time given for the origin of our species, Homo sapiens, most hominin species that aren't a part of our genus have gone extinct. For example, Paranthropus is no longer walking around, nor are any members of Australopithecus. Some have proposed that the reason that we lost those hominin genera, Australopithecus and Paranthropus, is because genus Homo was simply hominining better and outcompeted them wherever they were found together, at least by 300,000 years ago. This argument is supported in part, perhaps, by the presence of Homo naledi, where Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba were previously found all over the place in South Africa. Homo naledi being an extremely primitive, very apish member of genus Homo. That hypothesis doesn't hold up as well when looking at Paranthropus, which had diverged so much from the typical hominin generalist pattern that I can't imagine a situation where it's competing directly with members of genus Homo, but I digress, that's a topic for another time. Today we're looking at the extreme diversity of genus Homo from 300,000 years ago onward, and specifically we're homing in on the announcement of this new species, Homo juluensis, again from East Asia. So how does this thing fit in with the story so far? Well, by 300,000 years ago, we had a lot of hominins doing a lot of different things in a lot of different places across the globe. Homo naledi was, of course, milling around in South Africa, being small-brained and, like I said, pretty apish, especially in the morphology of the arms, and still maintaining some arboreal aspect to its behavior and lifestyle. We have the diminutive dwarfed hominin, Homo floresiensis, as well as Homo luzonensis, eking out a living in Indonesia, and of course, we have Neanderthals and Homo sapiens milling about in Eurasia and Africa, respectively. There are also countless populations of hominins that may be on the lineage leading up to Homo sapiens, having diverged off in their own direction, or the same situation but with Neanderthals, and maybe those populations deserve their own species, or maybe they should be subsumed into Homo neanderthalensis or Homo sapiens. Those are also stories for another time. So to simplify, for our big-brained members of genus Homo, so booting out Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis, and I think that's fair to do because they're pretty isolated as they stand as populations, we have Homo neanderthalensis in Europe and Western Asia, we have Homo sapiens in Africa, and then we have East Asia. I say that ominously because while you can clearly associate Homo sapiens as being the dominant hominin in Africa and Homo neanderthalensis as being the dominant hominin in Europe 300,000 years ago, and of course, again, there are other populations of hominins and there are patches of introgression and gene exchange between all of these guys, there is not a single hominin that you can say is kind of ruling East Asia 300,000 years ago. There are like a bunch of different guys. East Asia is going to be boasting late surviving Homo erectus, a group of hominins known almost exclusively from their genetics called Denisovans, and another group of hominins that are roughly linked together by suites of physical characteristics, their morphologies, called the East Asian Archaics. Now, late surviving Homo erectus is pretty diagnostic. It has these characteristics that pretty clearly demarcate something, a hominin in East Asia, as a member of late surviving Homo erectus. So we can kind of set that guy aside for now and focus instead on Denisovans and the East Asian Archaics, because we have something of a problem. The East Asian Archaics and Denisovans, neither of them have a fully agreed upon binomial nomenclature or species name. And it may be that Denisovans is a member of whatever the East Asian Archaics are, or it may be that Denisovans is something separate and that there are also several species that are found within this group that we're currently calling the East Asian Archaics. It's hard to tell because in addition to the issue of not having very much fossil material to ascribe to Denisovans, only having genetics, and in addition to not having genetically tested most, if not all, of the East Asian Archaics, every single one of those guys is seemingly interbreeding with each other, exchanging genes and thus morphologic characteristics, and all of that is happening while Neanderthals are frequently making incursions into this region and evidently also interbreeding with everybody. I'm being hyperbolic, but that's because these little romantic trysts that these hominins were having 300,000 plus years ago are making the job of modern paleoanthropologists and paleogeneticists very difficult. I promise I'm not trying to slut shame the hominins. I think I can lay out the question very simply like this. How many species of hominin were in East Asia during the Middle Pleistocene? How are they related to one another? And how are they related to Homo sapiens? A super simplified and vaguely consensus cladogram might look something like this, at least at present, where we have Homo erectus on the far side there off by itself, then we have a group of united hominins by their big brains and other aspects of their morphology as well as their genetics that include Denisovans, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens, where Denisovans and Homo neanderthalensis are sister species to one another and together make up a sister group to Homo sapiens. Now, the node that splits that group from Homo sapiens is at approximately 600,000 years ago, and the node that splits Denisovans from Homo neanderthalensis is at approximately 400,000 years ago. So where do the East Asian archaics fit into this, and is this cladogram even roughly correct? Let's start with what we know to be correct. Homo sapiens, compared to all of these other guys, is represented by a unique suite of morphologic characteristics and a unique genome. We know, for example, that Homo sapiens is different from Homo neanderthalensis and vice versa, because Homo neanderthalensis also has a unique suite of morphologic characteristics and a unique genome. The questions lie with where Denisovans falls and how we separate out the East Asian archaics. For example, whatever Denisovans is, it is a sister group to Homo neanderthalensis on the basis of its genome. The question is, are all the East Asian archaics members of Denisovans? And if they aren't, where do they fall themselves? So let's get into that a little bit more. So what are we actually talking about when we use the words Denisovans and East Asian archaics? When I say Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, boom, there's an archetypal fossil skull or fossil cranium that you'd think of. When I say Homo sapiens, you think of a human. Denisovans and East Asian archaics, though, get a little bit dicey because, again, people don't exactly agree on what falls into these categories, and neither Denisovans nor the East Asian archaics have a consensus binomial nomenclature like Homo sapiens for humans or Homo neanderthalensis for Neanderthals. So let's talk about Denisovans first. So Denisovans was first announced in 2010, roughly speaking, when a handful of teeny tiny little fossils were found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, and scientists thought to search them for DNA. And when they ran a genomic analysis on these tiny little fossil finds, the first one being like a partial finger bone. It's actually quite small. People are often surprised by how little we actually had to go off of for Denisovans, and then they're more surprised when they find out why we went forward with announcing this as this, sort of enigmatic group of hominins. It was just a little distal phalanx, right? Like a little teeny finger bone. And when they got the genome from this thing, they found that it was entirely distinct from Neanderthals and from Homo sapiens, both of which already had their genomes fairly well known. In addition to this little finger bone, we also had a handful of molars of teeth associated with Denisovans, and then finally the biggest Denisovan fossil that is identifiably Denisovan is the Jahi mandible, which is just this sad little beat up partial mandible with two molars in it. Up until the last few years, this was all that was really ascribed to Denisovans, and because of that, it couldn't get binomial nomenclature because there was no really good type specimen. A type specimen is the specimen that represents the species and upon which every subsequent fossil is compared to. Of course, what makes Denisovans weird is we've got the genome for this thing. So we've got 4 or 5 scrappy little fossils and then the genome. Whereas with most fossil hominins, we've got oodles and oodles of fossil specimens that are attributable to that species and no genetics at all. You can imagine this is an odd problem to have, and it's especially weird given how many fossil crania or skulls are attributable to the East Asian archaics as a group. So we have Denisovans with little fossil material and tons of genetic work done on it, and then we have the East Asian archaics with no genetic material and tons of fossils attributable to it as a group. Now, one of the big researchers who is well known for work on the East Asian archaics and trying to tease them apart and parse them into understandable groups is Chris Stringer. And it's Chris Stringer who I stole this little graphic here from. Now, to be clear, Chris Stringer is not the first person to work on these East Asian archaics, nor is he even the most involved individual. He's just one of the most well-known Western researchers on the topic. A little quirk about publication is that sometimes publications are regionally specific, so given there are a lot of phenomenal Chinese research teams working on the East Asian archaics and, Asian Homo erectus and Denisovans in general, a lot of that stuff ends up getting published in Chinese or in journals that I don't have access to. So a lot of the information that I get about these enigmatic hominins has to be through Western collaborations. And that's why my big foray into this topic, I guess I shouldn't say my big foray, my first foray into this topic was with the announcement of one little guy that you might remember, the Dragon Man, or Homo longi. Stringer was an author on the paper titled Massive Cranium from Harbin in northeastern China establishes a new Middle Pleistocene human lineage, and this was one of the first papers that really dug into the Harbin cranium and tried to figure out what this thing is, as well as where it belongs in relation to other hominins. So this is the Harbin cranium here. It's an absolutely stunning cranium with one single molar preserved here at the back. One of the really cool things that came out of this paper, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this one because we have quite a bit to cover still, is that they undertook a phylogenetic analysis using a bunch of different physical characteristics of the crania of 55 different hominin specimens, including the Harbin skull, Neanderthals, some members of Homo heidelbergensis / Homo rhodesiensis. This is a mostly defunct collection of hominins that are assigned to like this group immediately before Neanderthals and immediately before Homo sapiens, as well as members of Homo erectus and of course Homo sapiens. And what they found is that under their analysis here, you have Homo sapiens being this monophyletic group over here, and then the sister group to Homo sapiens is not Neanderthals, but rather this monophyletic Harbin human group, and then Neanderthals, and then Heidelbergensis / Rhodesiensis, and then Homo erectus, which is super interesting. But one thing you will not find in this paper that Stringer is on is the name Homo longi. And the reason for this is that Homo longi was not named in this paper. Homo longi was named in a companion paper that had much of the same research team, but Chris Stringer is not on this paper, and it's for a very simple, albeit surprising and kind of interesting reason. It's because he doesn't agree that this new group should be called Homo longi. He agrees that there is a distinct population here, that this Harbin group deserves to be named something distinct, that it is distinct enough. But if you will recall, on the other paper that Chris Stringer was on, this little companion paper that we just looked at, the Harbin group includes more than just the Harbin skull. And one of those skulls, or crania I should be saying, because there's not mandibles associated with all of these, is the Dolly skull, or the Dolly cranium. And there it is with another familiar face, HLD6, who we already did a throwback for on this video. Now, the issue with this is pretty straightforward as far as science rules goes. When you find a specimen and you give it a new species name, it becomes the type specimen for that individual species. So if the Harbin cranium is in fact the same species as the Dolly cranium and as HLD6, then that means whichever one of those that was discovered first and given a name first, that's the name it has to have. And wouldn't you know it, the Dolly cranium was found before the Harbin cranium and before HLD6 and given a name before those guys, and that name is not Homo longi, it's Homo daliensis. So Chris Stringer disagrees with this companion paper, not because, again, he doesn't believe that this distinct population exists and is distinct enough to get a species designation, but because it shouldn't be called Homo longi. If Harbin is the same species as Dali, then both belong to Homo daliensis, if we're being consistent. Now, you might be like me, and you're thinking, that's weird. I wouldn't think that top-notch research teams would just ignore a rule like that. And so I went digging to see if there was any more to this story, and it turns out there is, because the team that named Homo longi actually responded to this objection made by Chris Stringer and others, and I'm using Chris Stringer here because he's the one who I saw make this argument. It's possible someone made it before him, but I saw the argument made by Chris Stringer on Twitter, and what's really neat is that this paper from 2023 by Christopher Bay, who is going to be the author on our Homo juluensis paper here in a moment, he writes in Dragon Man Prompts Rethinking of Middle Pleistocene Hominin Systematics in Asia, a response, which is really cool. I think that's so cool. He says, a good example of this is that an argument has been made on social media that on the basis of morphological similarities, the type specimen of Homo longi, the harbin cranium, should be assigned to Homo daliensis. And then he goes on to make an argument for why he feels like that isn't the case. The primary portion of his argument is that the first mention of daliensis at all in the literature has it as Homo sapiens daliensis by Wu and colleagues in the 1980s, and that it was proposed as this transitional form between Asian Homo erectus and Asian Homo sapiens back when the multi-regional hypothesis was still up and kicking, and that it was only ever mentioned as Homo daliensis rather than Homo sapiens daliensis by Dennis Etler, who was the first researcher to mention Homo daliensis. However, even in Etler's paper, the name is used only once in a figure and is never mentioned in the main text. It is unclear whether he intended to raise Dali to the species level. Although we do not know exactly what Etler was thinking when he included Homo daliensis in the figure, it would seem that he may have simply been replacing archaic Homo sapiens with a taxonomic name, more like a placeholder of sorts, something that is frequently seen in European and African research. So, I'm not sure what you do here. They go on to say it should be noted that the International Commission for Zoological Nomenclature, the ICZN, has clear instructions on nomina that have been proposed conditionally. A new name or nomenclature act proposed conditionally and published after 1960 is thereby not made available. Homo daliensis was never formally presented as a new species, and given current ICZN guidelines, it would seem the name is currently unavailable. So I'm not an expert on ICZN guidelines. I don't know whether or not the mention of Homo sapiens daliensis, like Homo daliensis as a subspecies in that original Wu paper, whether that counts, because Wu clearly intended for it to be a clear subspecies, but does that then equate later on to the species level? And if Etler had it as Homo daliensis but didn't make the official argument that Homo daliensis should be a clear species, where does that fall? These authors are making the argument that it doesn't count, right? That neither of these things count, but I'm not knowledgeable enough on the ICZN to know one way or another. It's just cool to see that this exchange is happening. Anyways, the important part isn't necessarily what we call these things, but how they group and how tight we want those groupings to be. If we were to take the publication we just looked at that Chris Stringer was on from 2021 at face value, then we've got this clear phylogenetic group, the Harbin group, that contains a lot of the East Asian archaics as well as the Harbin cranium. That paper had the Xiahi mandible, the one clearly assigned to Denisovans, the Harbin cranium, and HLD6 all together in a single group called the Harbin group. But is that appropriate? Well, it's pretty controversial, right? The Xiahi mandible is assigned to Denisovans on the basis of proteomics, on genetic work, which means that the fact that it clashes with this phylogenetic analysis on the basis of morphology is confusing and concerning. Add to that the fact that it was very difficult to even include the Xiahi mandible in that phylogenetic analysis, comparing it to the Harbin cranium, because the Harbin cranium is a cranium and the Xiahi mandible is a mandible. The authors point this out in the body of the text, where they say the mandible of this individual, talking about the Harbin skull, the Harbin cranium, is not known, but the phylogenetic analysis suggests that the Harbin cranium and the Xiahi mandible from the Gansu province of China form a sister group. The M2 size of the Harbin cranium matches the tooth size of the Xiahi mandible. It is reasonable to deduce that the Harbin cranium probably matches a mandible as robust as the Xiahi mandible without a chin. Now, the authors are obviously very tentative about their discussion of where the Xiahi mandible falls. They wanted to include it in the phylogenetic analysis, but they understand the limitations of its inclusion. That's super important. It's why they don't make very many sweeping statements with regard to the Xiahi mandible. But what that means is that the Xiahi mandible's inclusion in this Harbin group is kind of tenuous. And this is especially so when we take into account some of the other comparisons that have been made since this study. Consider, if you will, my video on the study regarding HLD6, which was a comparison of mandibles specifically from members of genus Homo and specifically the East Asian archaics. That paper that you can see on your screen now, which I covered about a year ago, by Wu and colleagues, Morphological and Morphometric Analysis of a Late Pleistocene Hominin Mandible from Hualongdong, China. Now, this paper isn't directly comparing crania, it's comparing mandibles, but it's a very very robust mandibular analysis. So it sort of gives credence to the fact that looking at the crania, Harbin and HLD6 share a whole lot, but that in their mandibular analysis, Jiahi is way too different to be included in this Harbin group. Basically, you can only make good comparisons when you have elements to compare, and HLD6 appropriately bridges the gap between Harbin and the Jiahi mandible, allowing comparisons through HLD6 of all three. And when you do that, the Jiahi mandible very robustly falls away from the other two, meaning that Denisovans does appear to be this different thing, at least if this paper on HLD6 is anything to go off of. And this holds if we look at Chris Stringer's phylogenetic analysis and understand that the authors were intentionally tentative in their attribution of the Jiahi mandible to this Harbin group, meaning that at least as of the HLD6 paper, Homo longi could be used to describe some of the East Asian archaics, and Denisovans was still being used as this general term for the Jiahi mandible and other associated Denisovan-style elements. But then Homo juluensis came along. Homo juluensis was announced across 3 separate mediums and a little bit of time. The first was actually not what you're seeing on your screen right now. Homo juluensis was sort of lightly tapped in a special issue called What's in a Name? Late, Middle, and Early Late Pleistocene Hominin Systematics with the same authors, Wu and Bei, and it was published in Paleoanthropology way back in May, on the 24th of May, 2024. Then it appeared a little bit more clearly in a comment in Nature Communications titled Making Sense of Eastern Asian Late Quaternary Hominin Variability, with again the same authors, Bei and Wu, but swapped. And finally, it was also published in a book by just Bei titled The Paleoanthropology of Eastern Asia. So what's going on here? Well, we've seen Bei and Wu before, actually. They were both on the paper arguing for the legitimacy of Homo longi, titled Dragon Man Prompts Rethinking of Middle Pleistocene Hominin Systematics in Asia. Bei is the lead author and Wu is the third author. So, do you guys think that these guys are going to argue that Homo juluensis somehow knocks down Homo longi? Or do you think they're going to complement one another in a way that perhaps validates previous criticisms of a Harbin group on the basis of the inclusion of Denisovans? That's right, Wu is the lead author on the HLD6 paper that masterfully showed that the Denisovans mandible falls outside of the group that includes HLD6, which has previously been expertly shown to have many similarities with the Harbin cranium. So if the Harbin cranium is Homo longi, and the Harbin cranium is considered the type of Homo longi, and if it's very similar to HLD6, which Chris Stringer and colleagues showed in their paper, and if the Jiahi mandible falls out as compared to the HLD6 mandible, which Wu and colleagues showed here, then Homo longi is legitimate, at least in its application to the Harbin cranium. Homo longi would get to exist and encompass a group of hominins, the Harbin group, that is a sister group to Homo sapiens, while Denisovans would still apply to the Jiahi mandible and represent a different sister group to Homo neanderthalensis. So where does Homo juluensis fit in? Well, it's Denisovans. According to Wu and Bei, or Bei and Wu, depending on which of their pieces you're looking at, the fossils that we call Denisovans should be called something specific. They are distinct enough to be their own thing, and the name that they think we should give that group is Homo juluensis. Homo juluensis is not a new hominin, it is just an official name for Denisovans if Homo longi represents a group of hominins that does not include Denisovans. And you'll notice here that they have also pulled HLD6 off into its own group with the Namada and the Maba material. They actually point this out in the body where they say the Hualongdong fossils, so HLD6, date to the late Middle Pleistocene and display a mosaic of characteristics that cannot be easily fitted into any one lineage. In this case, Hualongdong, HLD6, does not neatly fit into Homo juluensis, Homo longi, and certainly not to Homo floresiensis or Homo luzonensis, a good example, in fact, of the intricacy of the human evolutionary record. Now, this paper is not the paper, this study rather, is not the study that actually describes Homo juluensis in depth. Instead, we have to go all the way back to that paper in May, the special issue, What's in a Name, Late, Middle, and Early Late Pleistocene Hominin Systematics, specifically Zhujiayao Homo, a new form of large-brained hominin in Eastern Asia by Wu and Bei. All the way back in May, this was the first mention of juluensis, and I think really the reason it's gained a lot of traction now is because it got put in Nature Communications, which is a little bit more in everybody's face and orbit. The Zhujiao hominins, or Homo juluensis, are argued to be Homo juluensis and also include Denisovans within their fold on the basis of a couple of different characteristics, and they lump them together on the basis of comparable morphology. The first, they say, is a very large cranial capacity combined with a low and wide cranial shape. 2, unusual Neanderthal-like bilevel nasal floor, temporal labyrinthine proportion, and thin occipital torus. 3, relatively large dentition that has a mosaic of primitive and derived features. And 4, a slow rate of dental growth and development state that is more in line with modern humans than earlier hominins, as well as 5, a mosaic of archaic and modern features of the mandible and temporal bone. Then a little bit later, they show you kind of what they're working with. It's some pretty scrappy material, but when all is put together, you can see a really nice posterior view here in figure 1F that they later show a comparison with some other East Asian archaics and show you how it is pretty distinct looking from this view. The argument then is Homo juluensis isn't necessarily a new hominin. It's a hominin that's been with us for a very long time that's finally gotten a name. If Homo juluensis is legitimate, then it is Denisovans, and Denisovans is Homo juluensis, which is kind of crazy because Denisovans has lacked binomial nomenclature for so long. So then the question is this legit? Now, there have been some murmurings on Paleo Twitter, or I guess it's Paleo Blue Sky now, where people have talked a little bit about the diagnostic criteria, that they're not necessarily applicable to all of the specimens, and that some of them are a little bit maybe inappropriate, like a large cranial capacity in and of itself being diagnostic. And I guess they do sort of softly combine it with the shape of the cranium, but the murmurings that I've been seeing have been sort of unimpressed by that character in particular, although Paleo Blue Sky has acknowledged that there are some characteristics that seem to unite this group of Homo juluensis that are unique. But I guess the question then is, at what point are we just splitting hairs? How many species are too many species? And you guys know how I feel about species as a concept in general. I think it's applying a static concept to a dynamic system, that being speciation and evolution. Ultimately, I don't think species represent a biological reality. They're just a useful tool for communicating with one another about groups of organisms. So how many species is too many species when it comes to communicating with some level of clarity? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that within paleoanthropology, and I bet this applies to every paleontological sort of subfield, but this is the area that I tend to haunt, so this is where I see it, we might have something of a consistency problem. Right? So we're using these characteristics to split Homo juluensis off from Homo longi and from groups of Homo sapiens and from whatever HLD6 is. But then simultaneously we recognize Homo erectus as a single species that lived for 2 million years across the entirety of the old world with just extensive morphologic variation, a brain case size that ranges from within the 500s to above 1200. Really? Are we sure that's the move? Now, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm committed to the idea of splitting every single population into its own human species, but we probably do need to have a conversation in paleoanthropology about picking a lane. We either need to do some more lumping and consider things at the population level for clarity's sake, or we do some extensive splitting and make everything its own species. Put which one you prefer in the comments section. Now, normally this would be the end of our conversation about Homo juluensis, right? We would say, well, we've got this proposal, it might stick, it might not, it might end up being like Homo bodoensis and sort of falling by the wayside. We have to wait and see what the paleoanthropological community thinks of this, but there is something else I want to discuss very briefly, and that's a preprint. Uh-oh, it's a preprint, and the title is "The Phylogenetic Position of the Yuxian Cranium Elucidates the Origin of Dragon Man and the Denisovans." The first author is Feng, but the last two authors are Chris Stringer and Jijun Ni, who were, of course, the two authors that we discussed in the very first paper, that phylogenetic analysis that created the Harbin group in the first place and also included the Jiahi mandible in that group, along with HLD6, along with Dali. So what's going on here? Now, this is a preprint, so, big asterisk, take this with a grain of salt. Although, considering the authors and their work in the past, I think that you can take it with a smaller grain of salt than you normally would. I think Stringer and Ni have done wonderful work. Obviously, we've discussed some of the work here in this video, but that being said, it has not passed peer review yet, and we want to hold off on passing judgment and sort of considering this as a part of the literature until it does. But I do want to talk about it because they ran another phylogenetic analysis, and I think it might be important to consider for this Homo juluensis conversation. We're not going to worry about the body, the text itself just yet. We're going to wait till it passes peer review for that. I just wanted to take a really brief look at the phylogeny that they have here in this figure. And if I'm being honest, another reason we're not going to dig into the main text of the paper is because I have not read the whole thing yet, and I do not know which characters they use to construct their phylogeny. I haven't seen what they have to say about it. This popped up at the very end of me recording this video, and I just thought it was worth it because there's one thing I want to note before we sort of end this, and then we'll come back to it again when it passes peer review. So what they've done here is they've run a phylogenetic analysis on some group of characteristics. They've got their Neanderthals here. They've got at the very top at our most out group here, Homo habilis and the Dibonisi specimens. And then they have their Dragon Man lineage. And this Dragon Man lineage includes many of the guys that we've talked about so far in this video. There's Harbin there's Dali, there's Maba, there's HLD6, there's the Jiahi mandible, and all together, these guys form a sister group to Homo sapiens and not Homo neanderthalensis. Again, we're seeing this hash out in a way that's like disagreeing with the genetics, which is strange. In skimming this preprint, they do talk about this, and I think they have a pretty good explanation for it, although it's more of like a this could be the reason, and we're going to investigate it further. So, put a pin in that. Really what I want to note here isn't necessarily the location of this Dragon Man lineage in relation to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but a specific monophyletic group that's found within this Dragon Man lineage. If you look right where my cursor is hovering, you can see that Pinku, Jiajiao, Jiahi, and Denisova are all grouped together in this monophyletic group that is sister to HLD6. But this is the series of specimens that in the paper that we looked at today about Homo juluensis lumped together as members of Homo juluensis. So it does seem like, according to this pretty extensive phylogenetic analysis, that these guys do fall out as a group, as this recognizable population. Again, the question remains, is this population distinct enough from adjacent populations to merit its own species? And that's a question that I can't answer. There's a lot more interesting stuff found within this figure, like the location of Harbin and Dali and Maba and Hualongdong as compared to the hash out that we saw in the paper covering Homo juluensis. Like, it's interesting that the Homo juluensis group does seem to fall out together, but everything else is kind of a smattering across the board and doesn't seem to match what we just saw in the figure of Bei and Wu's paper. So we'll see how that ends up coming out in the wash, but for now, I just think it's interesting to point out that the phylogenetic analysis in this preprint does seem to validate a population that you could call Homo juluensis, maybe. For me personally, I'm going to hold off on accepting Homo juluensis as a concrete species, just like I have been doing with Homo longi, until we have a phylogeny on the basis of morphology that matches what we're seeing with the genetics. And this is a problem that's pretty unique to this period in time, namely because all of these guys, whether they're distinct populations or not, are exchanging genes so often and are doing so in so many different places, and they're being recorded in these fossils, in our fossil record, because this is in the recent past. This is a quandary that we don't really face in the more distant past, because fossilization is a lot rarer and a lot less likely to capture these rare admixture populations. In the Miocene, for example, the distinction between Dendropithecus and Limnopithecus isn't subtle. TLDW, maybe Homo juluensis is a legit species. We'll have to wait and see. What do you think? I want to hear your opinion. Leave it for me in the comments, which, by the way, is a free way to support the channel in addition to liking and subscribing. It helps me with the algorithm gods. And if you want to help me in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos when I'm on top of things, which I have been lately. And they also get their names at the end of almost every video. Sometimes when Premiere Pro is being annoying, I have to cut it because for whatever reason it doesn't like my ending animation. That's neither here nor there. But it's fun. You get to show everybody that you support Gutsickgibbon. You can be like, look, that's me right there at the end of the animation on the Gutsickgibbon video. Isn't that cool? So, from the bottom of my gentle and of course very modern heart, I want to thank you for being such a curious primate, and I will see you real soon next time.